So now we can go back to our old definition of empire, cut and dry definition. A dominant society's control of the effective sovereignty of two or more subordinate societies that are substantially concentrated in particular regions or homelands within that empire. But what do we mean by effective sovereignty? It's clearly not just juridical. We can also, another definition is a system where a dominant state controls both the foreign and domestic policy of its subordinate states. Probably a better one. So why do states engage in empire building? What are the motivations? It's obviously not just about power, or every relatively strong state would be doing it. Empires can be explained as a rational calculus, costs and benefits. So anytime we have a power imbalance, are we going to find empire? No. The motives of both the metropole and the periphery are important. They're shaped by domestic elites, for example, military elites, business elites that might have interests that end up pushing a state towards empire. It's also about the complicity of domestic elites within the local target population, the periphery population, which are necessary to avoid war versus empire. Often they're frequently co-opted. You also have to take into account the international system. For example, the dominant norms in the international system, the potential of other rival imperial centers to get involved, powers that have imperial capabilities. So, empire can be the outcome of integration, but it doesn't have to be. You can have economic integration, even political economic integration, where some autonomy is ceded to central authorities. But this doesn't necessarily mean that it's empire. Look at the EU, for instance. States are free to leave it if they want to, but they normally find it in their interest to stay. So they're losing some of their sovereignty as members of this union, but it doesn't mean that they're part of empires. So the terms disengagement, hegemony, and empire are important ones here. And they're differentiated by the relationship and the degree of control. Disengagement basically means sink or swim. You're your own state. Run the state as you wish. Empire, of course, is a system where a dominant state controls both the foreign and domestic policy of its subordinate states. And then we've got hegemony. Hegemons, by contrast to these, focus on foreign policy, especially with respect to the hegemon in question, but also with respect to that hegemon's broader interests. Often, this is caused by a response to a security dilemma. States frequently want a sphere of influence, quote unquote, where they create a buffer between themselves and their potential adversaries. In the Soviet period, in the Cold War period, I guess I should say, the buffer zone for the Soviets, for the Russians in particular, but for the Soviets against the West was Central Europe. These were these satellite communist countries. They were really countries that would serve as a buffer zone from the enemy, which was the West. Now, unlike imperial powers, hegemons acknowledge the political costs of using force and therefore attempt to first exercise influence through other means. They don't want to come in and invade. And when those instruments are ineffective, then a hegemon might resort to force if they feel like they have to, which justifies which can violate a small state's sovereignty by appealing to some overriding principle. So signals here are important. For a hegemon to be credible, it may need to occasionally demonstrate its will to enforce compliance. Direct military intervention by a hegemon is a last resort measure used to secure the hegemon's interest when political and economic leverage are ineffective. But it's a last resort, and this conveys signals to potential renegade states in the form of reputation. If you know that we can, if we really have to, use force, then you're going to be on your best behavior. The idea, though, is to keep intervention, especially military intervention, at a minimum. A nice quote here. If your strength is recognized, you can generally achieve your aims without having to use it. And that was really key. That was key to keeping the Soviet Union around for so long, and the communist countries of Central Europe within the Soviet Union also, in that sphere of influence, because people knew that they could come in anytime they wanted to, because they'd proved it before. They didn't have to prove it every day. They only had to prove it every couple decades. It's to say, well, I don't want to get into it. It's probably an awful analogy, so I won't even bring it up. So all this might be irrelevant when small states acknowledge the benefits of bending to a great power, and therefore voluntarily cede some degree of autonomy, often in return for an increase in their own security. And there are plenty of reasons why we might expect to see a recurrence of empire in post-Soviet Central Asia. First of all, there were Russian interests. There was a security dilemma. Central Asia was a buffer between Russia and Afghanistan, also between a part of Russia and China. This whole western flank of China would have to go through. Of course, Russia shares, over here, you can't see it, where all the pretty little drawings are. Russia shares a very long border with China also, but this is another part. There's also the nature of the Soviet breakup. There was no fight, so there's not a new strong... you don't have new strong countries that emerge. You just have a weakening of the old one, which leads to these new states. So it's not like all these states were born out of strength. They were actually born out of weakness, which means that they're easy to go in and take over. You also have cultural similarities, which I've stressed a lot. In the early 1990s, I've mentioned this before, you have increased nationalism in Russia, this desire to protect ethnic Russians or other quote-unquote Russian interests in what they called the near abroad, which is the post-Soviet countries. You've got economic dependence on Russia, and you've got the state being much stronger in Russia. There are also good reasons, though, not to expect a reoccurrence of empire. And one of these is that you had various countering foreign interests, at least in a couple, where you had nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan at first, and then other geopolitical and resource links that would make countries like the United States and China interested also in the region. And with other interests, you tend not to end up with empire. You've got also the wariness of leaders to give in to anything but coercion. In other words, the Kazakh, well, especially the southern tier down here, and probably Kazakhstan as well, they all embraced independence to the degree that if Russia had wanted to come in, it could only have done so through its military. And Russian capabilities throughout the 1990s were really overextended up until very recently. You had the military in Chechnya, you had economic dimensions in the early 1990s. Russia was looking inward. It wasn't interested, for example, in bankrolling reforms in the newly independent states because it didn't have enough money. You also had enough of a degree of democracy in Russia throughout the 1990s that people didn't want to pay the price for the whims of their elites who might decide to come down here. Now that's different today, and it's been different under Vladimir Putin. It's questionable whether, if you recall in 2008, hopefully you recall, if not I'll just tell you, the Russians went into Georgia to free these secessionist areas, free quote unquote, take over these secessionist areas. So the question is, would Russia under President Yeltsin, a much more democratic, if drunken and incompetent leader, have done this? Probably not, because democratic peoples tend not to support these sorts of things. Although with a rise in nationalism, it's possible. But it wasn't a rise in nationalism in the 2000s, in 2008, that led Vladimir Putin to do this. It was a position of strength and less democracy. So in the 1990s, we could talk about a degree of democracy in Russia that meant that people wouldn't support this. And finally, there was simply no need for Russia to get involved because Russia often got its way without empire, at least to a certain extent. So actually, I'm going to stop here for a second.